Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Max. I'm the director of Forward Student Access University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening for our first hybrid lecture. We're really looking forward to the day when we can welcome all of our guests back to campus for in-person events. Nice to have our students here. But thank you for many of you who are joining us on Zoom. I'm sure that by now most of you are experts in using the Zoom platform, but just as a reminder, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask them. We'll monitor the questions and present them to our speaker at the end of the talk. Last year, we hosted several online programs featuring the scholarly work of our talented and diverse affiliated faculty. It's my honor to introduce one of them to you tonight. Dr. Gilad Shafi is an assistant professor of philosophy and religious studies in the College of Liberal Arts, and he is a scholar of modern Jewish thought. He is going to introduce you to our speaker.
I'm taking my back off. Okay, so this is a new thing. So it's funny you actually can see my face. So hi everyone, it's very nice to see you all. Thank you for coming. And thank you so much, Diana and Jill, for this event. I really appreciate that. And first, this event, as was just mentioned, is a co-sponsored for both BHI and the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And I'm very, very happy and honored to have Professor Melon here with us today. Just a few words about Ronnie Baron. She's a professor of philosophy at Bar Ilan University. From Israel. Her research is focused on post-Kantian idealism, existentialism, phenomenology, and hermeneutics, as well as current Jewish thought. She employs an interdisciplinary perspective combining the aforementioned traditions. She is the author of a few books. The first one is called The Jaspers from Self to Being from 2012. The Desire for Metaphysics, selected papers on Karl Jaspers of 2014. The Angel of Jewish History, the Image of Jewish Past in the 20th Century, again from 2014. Husserl and the Other Phenomenologists, it's an edited volume from 2018. And Hedwig Konrad Martius, the Phenomenological Pathway to Reality, Springer, 2021. This was really recently published, and congratulations for that. So I don't want to take too much time of your talk. So I will thank you again, everyone, for coming, and everyone at home for attending. And I'm looking forward to a wonderful conversation.
Okay, so I hope you can hear me. So good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here. I'm very happy to see you here in present, and thank you very much for all the organizing efforts, and especially for Professor Gilad Shafi. I'm happy for this opportunity to share with you my studies over the last couple of years on modern Hebrew thinking, again combining philosophical perspective on the issue that I will discuss this evening. This, as you can see here, this is the cover of the book on the issue of my talk. It explores many of the ideas that I will discuss today. So the basic question that I'm going to address this evening is the modern attitude towards the past that disregard Jewish Judaism, or current Judaism, will serve as a case study for our discussion. Obviously, one's attitude towards the past implies one's understanding of the present time and his or her view of the burdens or the possibilities that are brought from the past into the present and the future. So my talk focuses on a particular case study. It's taken from a well-known historiographical debate regarding modern Jewish historiography. I wish to demonstrate that this debate involves the main divisions that also exist in classical Western philosophical discourse, which is divided into ontological and epistemological aspects. Against this background, I shall argue that the suggested analysis is applicable also for other modern cultures that are occupied with their past, and what culture is not occupied with its past. One of the arguments common in sociology and anthropology of culture is that secularization creates a fundamental change to the point of a break in history of culture, or alternatively, starts a new history. This statement assumes a relation between religion and historical reality. Thus, in reality in which religion possesses weight and significance for people, the historical process is characterized by continuity. However, this historical continuity is broken when the phenomenon of secularization pervades that society. Despite this approach's simplicity and its being disputed from various angles, it has played a decisive role within the discourse regarding the nature, the meaning, and the implication of memory and of modern historiography. In this regard, two fundamental approaches can be noted. One expresses a diachronic observation that examines present reality in light of past events. Accordingly, the reality of secularization is perceived as expressing a break and detachment from the collective memory whose roots are planted in religion and tradition. The second reflects a synchronous observation focused on the present-day reality of life. At the center of this approach is the argument that despite the great changes in the status of religion, in a reality of secularization, there are core processes of translation, adoption, and adaptation of contents and values from the tradition to the present-day reality. Thus, historical continuity is enabled. The imprint of these approaches is already apparent in the writing of the first Jewish historians from the 19th century, who sought to examine Judaism as a historical phenomenon in a specific time and place while using objective tools. These Jewish intellectuals operated in a tension in their perception of Judaism. On the one hand, a few of them regarded Judaism as a phenomenon whose time has passed and understood historical research as a science that requires an account of what has been concluded. On the other hand, others insisted that Judaism is still a living phenomenon. This early tension, which was first manifested at the beginning of the 19th century, reached one of the peaks of its formulation in the debate between the two historians from the late 20th centuries, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi and Amos Funkenstein. Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi is mostly known for his books Zachor and Freud's Moses. Zachor is a transcript of a Hebrew word which means remember in the imperative form after the religious commandment that originated in the Bible. Funkenstein, is often known for his book Perceptions of Jewish History from 1993 and Theology and Scientific Imagination from 1986. Zachor by Yerushalmi and Perceptions of Jewish History by Funkenstein are discussed extensively in my book, The Angel of Jewish History from 1913, okay. And the book addresses the question of the meaning of the Jewish past in the 20th century via the thinking of three central intellectuals and scholars. The first is Gershom Scholem, this is Baruch Kurzweil, and the third is Nathan Rodenstein. Gershom Scholem, who is known as the founder of the field research of Kabbalah, Baruch Kurzweil studied the modern Hebrew literature, and Nathan Rodenstein was a philosopher and a Zionist thinker. However, in this talk, I will focus on the related paradigms that also serve in my book as point of departure. The first paradigm is represented by Yerushalmi. It stresses the break of the modern secular Jewish with the past and tradition in general. I argue that Yerushalmi's approach manifests an ontological observation whose focus is subject to the historical reality itself. Accordingly, Yerushalmi grants a decisive weight to the entity-like aspects within the secular worldview that took shape in modern Jewish reality. In this regard, God is the ultimate example of an entity-like aspect. Thus, removing God from Jewish culture and history, and in particular, doing away with the idea of providence according to which Jewish history is ruled by God, plays a decisive role in the break model. Yerushalmi goes so far as to argue that dismissing God from Jewish history is not only constitutive of Jewish historicism, but is also its last meaning. So this is Yerushalmi, and he addresses an ontological gaze to Jewish history, maintaining that actually the subject matter or the issue that is at stake in historical study is an ontological one. Namely, it discusses the figures, the entities that are active, that take part in the Jewish history or history in general, and accordingly, this is the modern situation that declared the death of God or its irrelevance, actually removed its presence from Jewish history, and he says that this is actually the foundation and the most basic infrastructure of modern Jewish historicism, to the extent that this is the meaning, this is the last meaning of this historicism. You must remove God from the scene in order to be able to write and to consolidate the field of Jewish historicism. So this is Yerushalmi. The second paradigm is by Amos Funkelstein. And as promised, he addresses an epistemological gaze to the same thing. Funkelstein represents, as I said, the second paradigm of historical continuity. My argument, is it okay, this clip? I do something wrong.
It's just somebody's email.
An email? Okay, I'm fine with it. Just wonder if
I'm sorry.
My argument in this regard is that Funkelstein addresses an epistemic gaze to modern Jewish attitude to the Jewish past and tradition in general. Accordingly, Funkelstein stresses the aspects of knowledge and interpretation. In his view, these aspects have always been and are still in modern times central to Jewish culture. Funkelstein dismisses the argument of the break in favor of understanding the historical perspective as another link in the ongoing chain of historical continuity. Although he never, in other words, what Funkelstein argues is that it is just the way modern Jews relate, address, understand their past by historical means, but this is just another phase. But what is always taking place in Jewish culture is this attempt to interpret, to understand, to relate to the past, and nothing particularly breaking here, because we are having the same practice of interpreting the past by current means. I can tell that I was present in one of the last lectures Funkelstein then was already very sick, delivered in Jerusalem. And although he never admitted that, his argument has been widely acknowledged as his scholarly, has been largely acknowledged by in the scholarly community as Funkelstein's response to the whole by Yerushalmi. Funkelstein stresses the centrality of the mental attempts of individuals and groups to achieve self-understanding through dialogue with the canonical sources of tradition and constant absorption of influences from the surrounding culture. Funkelstein dismisses the argument of a break in favor of understanding the historical perspective as one among many possible links to the ongoing change of historical continuity. Indeed, for him, the constituting of historical perspective regarding Jewish past is a positive milestone in the crystallization of modern Jewish consciousness. He also contends that despite the changes that occurred in Jewish being in the age of secularization, the possibility still remains open for Jews to experience a relation of continuity towards their past. They should also be able to show commitment to existence of Judaism in the future, whatever the expression of such a commitment might be. I shall visualize the fundamental differences between the two approaches in the following slide. So Yerushalmi approach emphasizes the presence of the transcendent entity in Jewish existence, sometimes identified with God. The ontological aspect that determined the character of this existence seems to appear to him as rigid elements whose accessibility by consciousness is limited. This approach prescribes a considerable marginality of the epistemological aspects. This concerns consciousness being open towards the world of its subject and being able, in principle, to understand it, while the transcendent is, by definition, beyond consciousness and often also beyond understanding. Funkelstein approach, as we already have seen, is different. It stresses the importance of the mental relations Jews directed at their past and their canonical sources over the generations. Accordingly, the epistemological clarification is considered as central to the historian in this approach, and the ontological issues embodied in these relations are pushed aside. The focus on the epistemic dimensions of Jewish existence is apparent in Funkelstein's approach, in that even the appearances of the transcendent are mediated by mental relation directed at it, whatever they affirm or deny their existence. In my view, the differences between these two approaches amount to the primordial difference between ontology and epistemology, or even between realism and idealism. Accordingly, in my book, The Angel of Jewish History, I consolidated out of them two paradigmatic models. These models were formed for dealing with the metaphysical problem of the relations between transcendence and immanence in modern historical space. The model based on Yerushalmi's approach is largely crystallized around the element of transcendence, and I named it the break model. In contrast, the model based on Funkelstein's approach, relying on the consistent relation to the immanent space, is referred to as the continuity model. So let us go a bit deeper into each of these models. The break model is based on the recognition of a forceful presence of the transcendent given, overcoming the many shades of immanence and especially consciousness, the subject, history, and time in general. This transcendent might be not only God, but also a specific tradition, race, language, nationality, territory, or everything that is considered as an indispensable element in a personal or collective identity. Also, the transcendent given has precedence over its immanent expressions. In this regard, nationality or religion might be considered as a transcendent element that decides who can enter the circle of belonging and who remains outside it, regardless of one's mental attitude toward the contents of that nationality or religion. Therefore, due to its considerable fixity, the transcendent does not absorb the historical and concrete temporality. In this regard, the transcendent is not supposed to encounter the problem of historical continuity between different eras. Simply, the status of the transcendent is not conditioned by the current circumstances, temporal aspect, or any personal attitude directed at it. It should be apparent then that this model imbues a special sensitivity to the possible revealing of historical research. The main concern is that objective consideration will not enable counting the transcendent datum as a meaningful factor in history, or alternatively will relativize it and thus dismiss its absoluteness. Instead, in the break model, real time, the elementary framework within which historical research takes place, is considered as mere substrate on which events appear without constituting an active dimension in them. Therefore, the very establishment of modern historical research in which real time becomes an active element and influences the meaning of historical event is considered as a break in tradition and culture. Finally, the break denotes a transition from the metaphysical atemporality to real temporality. This is the break model. So different is the model of continuity that is based on the analysis of the study of the thinking of Amos Finkelstein. In contrast, in the continuity model, the dominant power that constitutes the meaning and significance of human existence resides in the immanent sphere, namely in the real world and human relations to it. The unity that forms in the break model due to the power of the fixity and independence of the transcendent event are replaced in the continuity model by multiplicity, variance, and constant change. The organizing element of continuity is the subject conscious act revealing activity towards the real events comprising the human world in both past and the present. Therefore, no threat is coming from the historical research or any other theoretical approach to reality. The continuity model does not preclude the possibility that the transcendent giver will be affirmed as meaningful to people, namely find space in the immanent sphere. However, in any event, the subject conscious as has primacy and precedence over the transcendent given. Thus, the continuity denotes the structure that organizes the occurrences on the historical, real, and temporal level. Of course, the organization of events or occurrences on one continuum does not necessarily imply the existence of shared meaning that unite them. Indeed, the structure of continuity overcomes the changing contents that appear on the axis of real time and is unconditioned on particular content. In any case, continuity is enabled thanks to the permanent structure of subject that relates to an object. That is to say, that this historical continuity is not regarded as conditioned by a recurrence of specific conscious content of meaning that is granted to reality. So this again is the continuity model, and it stresses the praxis of interpretation, of intending, of relation, of people, group, or individuals from the present time to the past. From a phenomenological point of view, the various, I suggest the second, I would say, second layer on this analysis would be a phenomenological one. The first elementary one divided the two approach to ontological and epistemological aspect, and now I go further to the second layer of the analysis, which is phenomenological. So from a phenomenological point of view, the various givens at the basis of two models requires different position. Regarding the break model, it is apparent that the transcendent object requires from the individual considerable restraint of the drive to represent this object or grant it with meaning through consciousness. That is to say, that the recognition that the human subject displays towards the subjects of his consciousness are out of place when the object is transcendent, since its meaning is not the fruit of the subject's conscious constitution. The peak of the activity directed at the subject is portrayed in achievement of a passive position towards the overt layer of the world of objects. This position constantly withdraws the subject from the controlling the space of object, and thus creates the free space in which a transcendent entity can appear before him. More precisely, the subject's passive disposition enabled the transcendent entity to be made present precisely in its transcendence, rather as an immanent representation of it. However, it should be noted that for its own part, the transcendent entity is autonomous and independent of a particular shaping of the subject's disposition. This is why the subject is required to adopt a passive stance towards the transcendent in order to enable its presence in the world. The restrictions that the transcendent entities puts on human consciousness are may detract these entities from the transparency for the subject referring to them. This might also harm one's ability to assimilate them into his mental world. However, lack of transparency and difficulty in integrating its meaning into one's life is precisely how transcendent entities can be experienced. In other words, unlike in immanent object, the transcendent ones will always remain completely opaque and sometimes even blocked before one's consciousness. In contrast, the disposition suiting the immanent object typical of the continuity model is primarily active and appears first and foremost by fixing the object as an object of the knowing subject. This positioning makes consciousness active and the object its acted upon element. In other words, the conscious activity is founded on a clear hierarchy between the act of knowing and the object at which it is directed. The subject judges the object, attributes qualities to it, determines its identity, and decides the relation between it and other objects. Sometimes the immanent object is regarded as silent, or at least as subordinated to the subjective intentions and ends. At the depth of the issue, these two models are based on perceptions of concepts of based on different perceptions of the concepts of immanence and transcendence of the relation between them. In the break model, real immanence and transcendence denote real modes of existence and realities, entities. Thus, immanence denotes the infra-worldly existence of humans rooted in time and space, and the real entity and the real reality surrounding them. Transcendence denotes God's and his marks, for example, in providence over historical reality. This conceptual perception thus determines an unbridgeable gap between immanence and transcendence. Also, the relations between these concepts are fixed and hierarchical. Transcendence has the primacy status, while immanence is subject to it and determined by it. So this is again, I distilled the conceptual aspect in the phenomenological gaze, and we see that these are two different, totally different concept of immanence and transcendence. Let's see what is going in the next model. Okay. Conversely, within the continuity model, immanence and transcendence do not denote entities with independent existence. Rather, these are two dimensions of the subject's mental activity. Immanence denotes the intentional action of consciousness directed at objects, while transcendence is identified with the object of conscious activity that exists beyond it and is not necessarily the fruits of its own creation. Basically, within the continuity model, immanence and transcendence are two dimensions that are simultaneously present in the same immanent framework. In this regard, they should be understood as equally primary. However, since the human subject whose mental activity posits the transcendent, logical precedence is still granted to the immanent element. This means that the objective world does not, in the proper sense, transcend the sphere of consciousness. These have far-reaching consequences, this diversity between the two models, not only in the historical sphere, but also in the philosophical sphere. And I just specified one results of this diversity of these two models, and this concerns the aspect of truth. We obviously expect a different concept of truth in each of the models. In the break model, truth is, as I said, is ruled by the split between transcendence and immanence, between transcendent a priori and non-experiential elements on the one hand, and the particular real human reality on the other hand. The concept of truth splitting the split system is the accommodation concept, in which truth or falsity of any given is determined by independent and transcendent criteria. This approach is trapped in a rigid dichotomy that is designated for enduring the superiority of transcendent aspect over any particular content. Therefore, any deviation from the character of the transcendent element or any change in its meaning is translated into a break and contrast. In this way, the very possibility of innovation regarding the past or any transcendent aspect is ruled out of the break model. On the other hand, in the continuity model, the continuity model assumes a concept of truth that is none other than the meaning shaped each time through the reference to the past object. This perception of truth expresses a constant relation and mental reference of consciousness to its object. Finally, no accord between a specific meaning from the past and present understanding of it is expected or even desired, but the continuing practice of interpretation of the past by people from the present. I wish to complete this phenomenological analysis with hermeneutical scrutiny of the two discussed models. In particular, I wish to point to the deficiencies as means of understanding the attitude of a specific culture to its past and history. In this regard, a few points can be noted. Okay. As we have seen with the break model, the past, just a second, not yet. Okay. As we have seen, with the break model, the past is perceived as representing a perfection, independence, and a prioriness. The contrast between the past or tradition is structured within this model, since it conceives the past as already given, while the present is a variant that is expected to adjust itself to it. Obviously, any mark that the present leaves on the past by means of representation or interpretation of it is suspected as a possible subjectivization or as a relativation of what is considered as true and genuine understanding of past and history. The first encountering failing is then the equating of the past with a certain meaning that is considered as true and dismissing the possible variations in its understanding. Obviously, the consolidation of orthodoxy regarding history and any other aspect of culture is impending. Also, the assumption that contemporary references to the past can conflict with its meaning as governed by transcendent given express an essential misunderstanding of the intentional act. To be sure, what is absolutely transcendent cannot be discussed. And to use Wittgenstein's phrase, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. In other words, absolute transcendent and human attempts to understand exclude each other. On the other hand, there is no other way to relate to the past but from the present that inevitably comes after it and consolidates its own perspective of it. However, this does not imply a contradiction or conflict with its meaning. Last but not least, in my view, the penetration of the conscious dimension in the discussion of the transcendent given is not only inevitable, it is desirable, since without it, the very giveness of the past as given of human experience is negated. Finally, the very fact that the interest in the past of that of the subject is not in itself sufficient to subjectivize its object or make it immanent. Instead, the influence of the reference on its object depends on the nature of the reference itself, not just on its very occurrence. Thus, for example, if the historian shows commitment to the phenomenon he is studying and enable the different voices within it to be heard, he or she may find an appropriate way to present it according to its spirit. The continuity model seems to represent exactly this possible failing seems to respond exactly to this possible failing of the break model. Most importantly, the continuity model assumes that the transcendent given and the human transcendental experience directed at it do not necessarily exclude each other. Therefore, within the continuity model, no gap, let alone contrast, is marked between the meaning of the past and the present day people's attempts to understand and interpret it. However, the continuity model is not without problems. However, maybe you were already convinced that it's much better. No, it's not the case. However, the continuity, like any approach anchored in immanent consciousness, this model is at risk of not preserving the qualified status of consciousness as a receptacle of the content and the reference to them. The worry is then that the current consciousness will be established, that current consciousness will be established as the constitutive authority of the meaning of the past, and thus disregard the peculiar meaning of past eras. The deep awareness of the transcendent nature of human experience that serves as basic foundation for the continuity model may eventually lead to denying the very possibility of experiencing transcendent entities, whatever the meaning of this experience. Hence, it might be problematic to apply the continuity model to the interpretation of traditional culture from their form around references to transcendent entity or perceiving their history as sacred. Finally, the dominance granted to consciousness and the sovereignty the human subject enjoying the continuity model raise the risk that the interpretation relying on this model will not be able to preserve the incommensurable character of contents in the collective memory, contents that are inseparable part of any culture or personal identity. Notwithstanding, the problems revealed in the two models are not sufficient to dispute the possible hermeneutic applicability of these models for the historical space, since illuminating the boundaries of the explanation typical of each model also clarifies the possibility they contain to grant meaning to certain aspects of historical existence. My journey in the Angel of Jewish History was to scrutinize the far-reaching consequences of the two models of break and continuity, whose consolidation is based on my analysis of the thinking of the historical interpretation of Yerushalmi and Fukashem. The leading question of my study was then referred to the meaning of the transcendence in an era of secularization and historical consciousness. However, the answer provided by the two portrayed models were unsatisfying. I thought that there must be a way to speak more than one language, so orthodoxy can be avoided. I believe that in most cases, a binary setting cannot provide a faithful access to human phenomena. I'll find a response to this consideration echoing in the thinking of the founder of the Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, Gershom Scholem, who testified as follows. Here is the guy. He said that. I'm convinced that the religious question in Judaism has not reached its conclusion and exhaustion, and that secularism is not the end. Secularity contains the religious dynamic. The Lord is such that even if you forget him for 3 generations, he will leave the 4th. In these words, Scholem replies to the break model with the following argument. It is not really possible to bring about the mentioned break, as there are hidden dynamics, and also the historical reality carries within itself the concealed. In this regard, historical study does not necessarily incapable of coming to terms with the meaning of the transcendent given to people. At the same time, Scholem responds to the logic of the continuity model with a slightly different tone. I imagine him establishing something like this. There is something stubborn, recurring, and maybe even constant in Jewish history. It is not really possible to disregard this something that often becomes an identifying mark of a culture that approves its existence. That is to say, that not only the very reference to the past persists, there are also persistent contents. In the same spirit, Scholem writes, I'm certain that there is something special that forces Jews to ask and seek an answer. And I'm sure that this substance is in some form will be crystallized anew in different clothing. But this substance of Judaism cannot be defined. It is one of the holistic, total things that cannot be phrased, but is present in our reality. According to the suggested reading, Scholem thinks that the historian not only refers to the past, but also looks for something substantial in it. This means then that in history there is something which is permanent and substantial, though we are incapable to define it. At the same time, precisely the existing dispute regarding this something answer the demand for continuous practice of reference itself that is central to the continuity model. Despite the Jewish context of Scholem's work, I believe it touches a genuine aspect in human search for meaning in life. In other words, the question of past tradition is never out of play, either for a conservative stance such as that of the break model, nor for the secular one that is typical of the continuity model. I shall finish my talk in a personal tone. I think that the fate of modern man is to preserve both stories of break and continuation, almost like the acrobat who keep 2 balls in air, and sometimes one of them falls down. Both stories should be preserved not as a compromise, but rather as an expression of the structured paradox in modernity. In my opinion, sometimes one should avoid looking for the solution, but instead maintain the duality, even at the cost of vagueness, in order to be able to see the hermeneutical wealth that is inherent in complexities and contradictions. In other words, I argue that myths can also be the appropriate environment for the engines of human histories. Thank you for your attention.
There's nothing in the chat. Students.
Maybe I'll show again. Sure. Sure. So thank you, Ronnie. This was really great and informative and thought-provoking. I really enjoyed it. And so I thought about those two models, and I thought that it's, for me, it's clear that the break model is clear. So there is no God, and it's evident that it's the difference or the break from previous periods is actually clear, in the sense that there are different forms of social organization, there are different forms of political organization, different forms of ethical organization. So it seems to be clear that when God is missing from the picture, there is a break and a new form of any kinds of political, social, ethical organization are appearing to be in place. What I'm interested in is if you can give us an example of how this continuity model is actually working, in terms of like specific example of how one is able to think of the past, or maybe even a specific point in the past or object in the past in a way that would suggest such continuity, because maybe for the people around and for myself, it's hard to imagine this, how this continuity is possible. So if you can say something about that.
Yeah, thank you for this very important question. Actually, this point to a part that I thought that I will not have enough time to present here, and it has to do with the very deep influence of this model. It's based on a long path in modern philosophy, starting from Hegel and on. And to make a very long story short, and say the following. The continuity model focuses on the structures. It says that as long as people address their canonic sources or their past, it's fine. Having that interest that is essential, indispensable for this very addressing of the past, of the canon, of tradition, and so forth, it's enough to bring about a continuity. Because for this model, the worry is not that the specific content or meaning will be preserved, but just this practice. Behind this idea is the modern, most typical idea model of a modern idea of the progress. That eventually what is most important is preserved, and all the things that are more specific and more relate to a specific context will be dismissed and will be forgotten, and this is fine. The best will be preserved and will last during the generation. And of course, there is no, not only worry, but even no sorrow for a loss of contents, of ideas, because the idea is the practice is the most important. And anyway, this is not argued explicitly, but I think this must be there in order to hold this stance, that it's fine that the best will be preserved. If you forget now for great poets 50 years ago, it's fine. Probably they are better than them and you can enjoy them. And if another next 100 years, you will forget about the poets that you have, that you adore now, it's also fine, because probably they will be better. And basically what is good is preserved, and what is not has no I would say, universal texture and just relate to a specific time and content will dissipate, and this is fine, okay? So the practice of interpretation, and Funkenstein said that this is what all Judaism is all about. Obviously, this is a secular stance, and this is a secular that accepts the changes that are unavoidable during the time. And Yerushalmi and the break model insist on the fact that what make what make a specific culture to what it is concern the specific entities that populates its culture. And if you, for example, if you remove the Bible from Jewish or Christian culture, so it's not anymore those culture. You cannot even refer to them the same way. So you have to. So there is an insistence on some specific layer, I would say, that must be there. And if you miss it, so you miss the whole thing. Okay.
Dr. Maroon, I have a question from one of our alumna. She says, can Dr. Maroon comment on how her modeling reflects on religiosity of global Jewry going forward? And will it remain a source of Jewish confusion or collapse?
Can you please repeat what is?
Yes. Can you comment on how your modeling reflects on religiosity of global Jewry going forward? And will it remain a source of Jewish confusion or Jewish collapse?
Well, this is actually a very important topic about the aspect of religiosity. I would start from clarifying that in no way I would say that in the break model there is much more care for religiosity, while in the continuity model there is this is unrespected. No, this is not the case. I think that religiosity is a very complicated, sometimes it appears as a loose stance that you do not insist on specific characteristic, but it is a specific way of attitude towards things. And I think both of them have their own kind of religiosity. The religiosity of the break model is more very much concerned about the totality of the culture, about the preserving the robust part of its past. It's more likely to be orthodox, because obviously if you want those contents to be preserved despite the current processes and things that take part in the present, so you have to create the means to preserve them. And this sometimes requires disregarding or neglecting other forces in the present. While the religiosity of the continuity model would sound really different, but nevertheless, I think it still has its aspect of religiosity. Because the question is, for the continuity model, what can we do and what can we have? And not what we can lose, but what we can have. And the answer is the following. As long as people are interested, as long as people care about their tradition, about their past, this already imbues something that is connected, that is identified, that has any attachment to that tradition, and this itself might suffice in nurturing this religiosity. It's different. I think this is much more loose and might be something more personal and not consistent with many other things. But this is something that also you cannot dismiss as unimportant or lacking any religiosity. It's different, because I think that asking present-day people to maintain their reference to the past, to the tradition, to the canonical text, this is also something I think that has its value, because I think behind that there is, in the continuity model, there is a trust that the very dealing with those canonical sources will itself generate an influence. You don't have to control it in advance. You don't have to dictate what should be the meaning of those sources. There is a trust that those sources can do and can influence in different eras, in different times for different people. And this is enough. This is another way of looking at the world, it's,
Another question.
yeah.
What is the relationship between the continuity model and Simology?
I think the continuity model is much more tolerant to this situation. Because if somebody says, of course, I keep nothing from my traditional religion, and I keep nothing from, but I still feel, for example, I still feel Jewish, or I don't practice anything, but I still feel Jewish. This is very much tolerated. But on the other hand, in the break model, the reaction to this view is that if you don't keep Shabbat, if you don't keep certain specific musts in this culture, so you actually take yourself out of this culture. So I think it's much more, and I stress the rigidity within the break model. And I think that I brought by the end the example of the words of Gershom Scholem, who was not a religious person, was exactly the person that was addressing the canonical or the traditional sources. And nevertheless, he maintained that there is something stubborn, there is something there that is constant, and that you cannot assimilate it or dissolve it into other things. This is something that actually embodies the essence of Judaism. So we see that it's not that we can simply divide the break model to Orthodox people and the continuity model to secular. It is, by the way, Yerushalmi was not an Orthodox Jew. He was very much attached, but I'm not sure that there was a great difference between his way of life and that of Frankenstein. The point is their attitude, and I think that there is not something much more in Yerushalmi point of view, something much more, in a way, sentimental, very much worried about the future of Judaism. And in Frankenstein, there is much more the idea of the progress, trust in the future. It will be fine. And what Jews are asked to do is just to continue to read their sources, and the work the influence will take place just by this practice of interpreting. And I think in a way, the Yerushalmi, the option that is brought by Yerushalmi can be accepted also for not people that are very much sophisticated, academic, scholars, and so forth. Because for them, these musts in their routine, in their practice, actually crystallize their identity as Jewish. While for Frankenstein, it is much more loose, it is much more, I would say, doesn't have to be necessarily secular, but basically the option of having, creating by yourself your identity, by reading, by interpreting, it addresses a specific, more educated people than the option suggested by Yerushalmi. People that can read it today in the 21st century, the Talmud, and find something that is relevant to their lives, should be people that are more experienced in this practice and are more intellectuals. It's sometimes it feels that they are talking to different audience. Please.
First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful talk, and which has made me think about so many different things, and now it's hard to pick which one to ask. But I think what I wanted to ask is, I guess throughout this talk, I've been thinking about Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi's other works, from Spanish Court to Italian Ghetto, and I've been trying to disentangle in my mind whether this paradigm that we've been talking about, continuity versus break models, is a kind of a frame of reference that you think permeates his other writings when he came to study the past, and whether Zachor sort of stands apart.
I myself have to think about that. I think in a way, Zachor was one of his last
Yeah,
books, and it pretty much was kind of his message to the community. And he was, in a way, in my view, much more sophisticated in his previous writings. I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
no, yeah, I guess my thought was that it was about whether the subject of From Spanish Court to Italian Ghetto was actually at odds with the model of the break. Where there's room for dynamism, the dynamism of the continuity model is much more present in that
Yeah,
context.
I think that in a way, in the whole kind of trying to come to terms with the very stance of being this Jewish historian. And there he says explicitly that there is a contradiction between his study and his work and his identity. To be a Jewish historian is a contradiction.
Yeah,
I think in a way it is, I don't want to reduce it to a kind of, his last words, but in a way, I think that this very, very simplistic model in a way that was very much discussed and in my view, not always with the pertinent analysis of the problems and the philosophical meaning that underlies
yeah,
it.
that's
This is what I try to suggest. I don't think that with such a stance he could address the topics of the 14th and 16th century. No, I don't think so. I think this was kind of his summary and something which has, in a way, a bit contaminated with his sentiment, his Jewish sentiment, and in a way, his worry for the future. His worry for the future of Judaism, for the vanishing of the Jewish culture and so forth. And this is, of course, understandable. But, also Funkelstein formulated his view also by the end of his life. He died relatively young, but this was also his last words, but he was very much has a secular agenda, and in a way, these two Jewish people cannot go to the same synagogue. And this is very often the case. Yeah, please.
I don't know if this is the right question to ask in this setting, but just thinking, I think of cultures and people who have no attachment to their culture, but yearn for it inside and go back to their culture. And then you have people who are tied to their culture early on who leave it. And you have this dynamic throughout the world of people moving closer to the past and trying to capture those connections and transcendence of the past, and those running away from it. And I just didn't know if you had a thought as to, the push and pull in society towards people's identities and that yearning to either escape it or move towards it.
As I said, I believe that the situation is so complicated that you cannot just simply adhere to one path and say this is the way you can practice, because you need them both. You need them both, and you need them both again, not as a compromise. Because in a way, the worry of Yerushalmi for the future of Judaism, for the ignorance regarding the Jewish canon or the Jewish tradition is something is understandable, and he tries to figure out what was the thing that secured the endurance of Judaism during the history and so forth. I think his answer is insufficient. I think we live in a world that suggests so many practices that are conflicting each other, and you simply cannot address it with one answer. I think that from Funkenstein, obviously the situation since then became even more complicated. But I believe that these two models do reflect the core of the movement into tradition and outside the tradition. I think that those who take their way back to the tradition are adhered to this rigid shape of tradition, while the process of just maintaining some specific practices and doing away with other aspects is very much communicate the other way. And I believe you need them both. And I think that the good thing that from keeping them together is that having them balancing each other, because I think that what we need today is a balance in the sense of keeping the tension that is created by their coexistence, keeping the tension, because the situation is so complicated. We have so many forces that are active in our reality. You just have to be able to keep this contradiction and this tension, and believe that it can be very creative and very, very much helpful in adjusting the so quick and so many changes in our time. I believe that it's not only a Jewish situation. I think it's something that speaks to communicate to other culture. I have this experience presenting these two models before a Catholic audience, and they say that they find it also communicating the situation, because it has this always very basic milestones that have their own dynamic in modern thinking, and it took shape differently in each culture, but basically it has its own characteristic, own specific face. We have here, I see.
No, I think,
Okay.
anyone else in the audience?
So thank you very much for your attention and for coming, and have a nice evening.
Thank you.